NBC's Yamiche Alcindor is reporting in Northampton, New Hampshire. NBC's Garrett Haake is in Washington, D.C. Also with us, Tim Miller, former communications director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign and an MSNBC political analyst. Yamiche, this has been a rallying cry for Democratic presidents going back some time. You and I were on the ground after the shooting in Newtown, where little kids, elementary school students, died. It became a rallying cry for Barack Obama. The great frustration of his presidency was he could not push through legislation, even after elementary school kids died in their classroom. And then we saw with Joe Biden some progress. He just mentioned in his statement the legislation he got passed, but he would acknowledge not nearly enough. And now you have Kamala Harris, who has brought it up multiple times. Does her campaign believe, Yamiche, that with young voters in particular, many of whom now, tragically, have lived through or know someone who has lived through a school shooting, that this can be an issue that people take seriously and maybe even vote on?
The campaign, the Harris campaign, certainly hopes that this is an issue that voters will take seriously, and in their minds, that taking it seriously will mean putting her in the White House. Vice President Harris, as you said, has talked about this issue multiple times on the campaign trail. We expect her to talk about this issue, talk about this latest shooting in Georgia at the top of her remarks that she's expected to give here in a few minutes here. And she's expected to say what she's been saying all along, which is that it's far too common that children go to school and then have to deal with a shooting at that school and have to deal with the tragic situations that you and I both saw when we were reporting in Newtown, which is children dressed up in suits going to see their best friends in caskets, at times tiny caskets. Those are the images that could never come out of my mind, and I'm sure never go out of your mind. So Vice President Harris has talked about that issue a number of times. We've heard from her running mate, as you said, Tim Walz, saying that this is tragic, this is too common. The President Biden, her former running mate, talking about the fact that Congress needs to do more here. So we expect Vice President Harris to say that Congress needs to act, that she, if she was elected and if the Democrats were able to get the Senate and the House, that they could pass gun legislation. That being said, this is going to be a very hard issue because, as you said, this is not something that has been easy to pass, and the negotiations have fallen apart time and time again. I also want to tell you, Chris, standing here in New Hampshire, it's a bit surreal because when you walk up and see where she's going to be speaking in a few minutes, it's encased with glass. This is one of the first outdoor events that I've covered with her, and this is the first time that I've seen her, as the top of the ticket, be encased in glass. And it's a reminder that gun violence is not just an issue that she's talking about, it's also an issue that the people who are trying to protect her are having top of mind as they're getting ready for campaign events like this one. And when you think about sort of what needs to be done for gun reform, it's why she's also in New Hampshire, campaign officials tell me, because this is not seen as a swing state. Democrats won it in 2016 and 2020, but this is seen as a state where Democrats need to get more control, they think, of the governor's position, because right now the state has a Republican governor, but they also want to make sure that they hold on to congressional seats here and that they also have state legislatures here. So they are really trying to focus on the down ballot races as she comes out to talk about her campaign, and she also is going to be rolling out some economic proposals as well. But I expect her again to talk at the top of this about gun violence and the heartbreak that we see now playing out in Georgia and that we've seen play out in so many other places, Chris.
And of course, these changes at outdoor venues as a result of the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. And Garrett, earlier this year, when there was a school shooting in Iowa before the caucuses, this is what the former president had to say.
Before going further, I want to send our support and our deepest sympathies to the victims and families touched by the terrible school shooting yesterday in Perry, Iowa. We're really with you as much as anybody can be. It's a very terrible thing that happened, and it's just horrible to see that happening. That's just horrible. So surprising to see it here. But we have to get over it. We have to move forward. We have to move forward.
That got a lot of people's attention. As you know, Garrett, we have to get over it. What is the Trump campaign position on gun reform?
Have one, Chris. I mean, this is just not something that ever comes up for Donald Trump on the stump. He's rarely asked about it in interviews, and he certainly doesn't bring it up on his own accord. And when he was president back in 2018, after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, he kind of floated the idea of having armed people. He said he didn't like the idea of armed teachers, but some kind of armed expert people in schools who could help ensure their safety. That effort obviously went nowhere, and he's not prioritized this issue at all. In fact, he's gone so far as to attack John Cornyn, the Republican senator from Texas, who was the Republican side of the negotiations on the gun safety bill that passed 2 years ago, as a rhino, a Republican in name only, for being willing to engage with Democrats on trying to do something to curb gun violence, especially in schools. That effort, of course, grew out of the shooting in Uvalde, which is the most horrible thing I've ever covered. This is just not an issue that Trump has put any particular policy or rhetorical effort behind it all. He might perhaps get asked about it at this town hall tonight. But if he does, it would be the first time I've heard him speak about the issue in this campaign.
So, Tim, I am reminded that one of the first people I saw on the ground after the Sandy Hook shooting was a priest who had worked with many of these little kids for their first communion. And so here we are again, this time with teenagers who are in a school. And I want to play for you some sound that we just got from a 16-year-old girl who was inside that school today.
All I could think was over at the middle school if my siblings were okay. That's what I was most worried about. I was worried. I thought I was going to die. I was holding some random kid's hand. My face was in somebody's fight. I was just trying to get away. But they could have. You never know. I just know they were on our hall. I didn't get to see anything. I was head down, like outside. I just saw the aftermath.
Head down, which sounds like something that they would be told when they were, training for the possibility of a school shooting, Tim. We know what the polls show. We know that most Americans, including gun owners, believe in what is broadly called common sense gun legislation. We ought to know who's getting a gun. We ought to know whether they had mental health issues. We ought to know whether they've had a criminal background. I could go on and on. Weapons of war that people have in their homes. Why has nothing changed? What's the politics of this that allows nothing to happen?
Yeah, that's just such heartbreaking video. And my heart goes out to all those kids and their families. Obviously, it's the Republican Party's fault, right? So we don't need to mince words. They're the ones that don't want any additional gun reforms, and in the few cases where there have been gun reforms, like such as after Parkland, maybe a lot of people forget Rick Scott, who now is a senator, put in place some pretty aggressive red flag laws and some things of this nature, and now the Republicans now that run Florida are trying to unwind all that and put in place constitutional carry. So that's what's happening here, and I think that. Just speaking about this just as a political matter, it's incumbent on the Democrats, I think, to continue to be more aggressive in trying to put the Republicans on the defense on this issue, because I was, as you mentioned, Kamala Harris mentioned this in her kickoff speech, gun reforms, red flag laws, assault weapons bans. I think that it's totally appropriate for her to do so. It's good policy and good politics. But I think that you can be even more aggressive and trying to make emotional appeals that really get to people's hearts about why this has to change. I think particularly when it comes to young people, I just think about the shooter that nearly assassinated the former president, Donald Trump, was 20. We don't know who the shooter is yet, but based on some of the video you played earlier, it seems like some of the students knew them, so they very well might be under 21. The idea that an under 21-year-old can carry a weapon outside in the public and cannot carry a White Claw is absurd. That they can go in and buy bullets is absurd. It's an 85% issue against that, and I think that with all of the horrible shootings we've had and all these murders that we've had where the shooter fits the same profile, I think it's incumbent upon people that want reforms to wage a very aggressive campaign to convince people to, at minimum, make it much, much harder to get people under 21 to get guns.